Recording. Thank you. All right, so I would like to introduce Keith Abney, a very aptly named professor, a philosophy professor at the California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo. He is a senior fellow of the Ethics and Emerging Sciences group, and has written a couple books, include Robot Ethics and Robot Ethics 2. He's worked on the ethics of space colonization. Oh, yes. Feel free to show off your book. He's worked on the ethics of space colonization, among other things, and is in a CEF project on predictive policing, which is also rather apt because earlier this year we actually had a UCLA professor who worked on predictive policing come and talk, although she did not discuss predictive policing. Professor Abney is also given briefings in industry, media, and government, etc. And he works on understanding the ethics, the intersection of ethics and technology. With that, I would like you to take it away, Keith.
Thank you. Most excellently named Keith. And today, there's lots of aspects of AI ethics I could talk about, but the focus today is going to be on the ethics of war and AI and robots. So that's what the presentation will be about. But if you want to ask me questions about other aspects of AI ethics, that'll be perfectly fine. As a matter of fact, I have a co-authored paper on COVID-19 and AI surveillance that literally came out today. But I'm going to start sharing the PowerPoint I made for this presentation, and we'll go from there. So I like to start with something other than the Terminator, because it seems like the Terminator is the usual robot they use when they talk about these kinds of issues. So I try to pick a different one. Oh, and by the way, if you want to post a question during this in chat, feel free. If I can, I'll get to it. And if not, I think I'm going to be talking with some of you guys this afternoon after lunch anyway. So here's the abstract. I'll let you take a chance to read that for just 1 second. We wrote a report on lethal autonomous weapon systems over a decade ago for the Office of Naval Research. And since then, as you no doubt are aware, it's been quite a topic of discussion, with groups like the Committee to Stop Killer Robots being petitioning and having meetings at Geneva in front of the UN to discuss whether or not there should be an international ban. But the military really doesn't want a ban. They think it's inevitable that we'll have completely autonomous weapon systems, as they call them, killer robots. And so we'll talk about the ethics of that and lay out some future scenarios that we may want to try to avoid if we can. So I like to think of what I do as anticipatory ethics to avoid the first generation problem. I like to think of my research as trying to identify a problem that's going to happen in the future before it happens, so that we can try to do something about it to forestall it or at least mitigate the damage. So what we'll be doing today is first giving you an introduction to the issue in terms of the underlying ethical theory that informs international humanitarian law and the laws of armed conflict, which is an ethical theory called just war theory. So we'll talk about that in something called the Independence Thesis. We'll then move on to the relevance of autonomous weapon systems to the issue. Then we'll talk about some foundational issues in ethics and meta-ethics, including the ought implies can principle. We'll then discuss some scenarios and come to some conclusions. So let's start with just war theory, as it exists as the basis for international humanitarian law. Just war theory traditionally is divided into at least 3 and now more commonly 4 parts. Jus ad bellum is the justice of declaring war or going to war. And that has to do with whether or not a nation state is justified in deciding to go to war. And there are usually 6 criteria, more or less, depending on which version you're defending. So, for example, it has to be publicly announced, no secret private wars. It has to be for a just cause. You have to have the right intention to secure the just cause, and so forth and so on. Now, in traditional just war theory, there's a separate part of just war theory called jus in bello, the justice of the conduct of war. And so the folks who make the decision to go to war or not, in the United States, that would be the president and Congress, theoretically, but in practice, the president. For them, there's jus ad bellum issues. For ordinary soldiers, though, jus ad bellum seems to be irrelevant. What matters is jus in bello. Ordinary soldiers, say in Afghanistan or Iraq right now, don't seem to have any decision-making choice about whether or not the war has been declared. Instead, what they're responsible for is, well, how they actually fight the war, the conduct of war. So, for example, do they only target combatants, and do they try to avoid killing or injuring non-combatants, right? Do they only use proportional force, and so forth and so on? So there are ethical rules for jus in bello, and they're typically seen as independent of jus ad bellum. So even if your nation state, your president, your leader declared an unjust war, that's irrelevant to the ethics of how you fight it. So, for example, World War II perhaps was a just war for the United States, but not for Japan. And by the way, it's part of just war theory that at most, only one side in any war could be just. But both sides of World War II, both, say, the Japanese and the Americans, could fight the war justly, could satisfy jus in bello, or both of them could violate jus in bello, could fight the war unjustly. So, for example, perhaps the United States side in World War II satisfied the 6 criteria of jus ad bellum, and so we were fighting a just war. But that doesn't guarantee that all the ways in which we fought it were then just. For example, perhaps dropping nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were unjust because they didn't discriminate between combatants and non-combatants, and they seemed to use disproportionate force. Now, the idea of war is to bring about a lasting and just peace. And so there's also jus post bellum, the justice of after the war, of how the war led to peace and what happens then. And so peacekeeping, as it's called, is a big part of just war theory. And increasingly, there's a 4th aspect that was not emphasized traditionally, called jus ad vim, the use of force just short of war. Because increasingly our anti-terror operations and such are, well, not actually part of declared wars. And so are the rules for jus ad vim the same as they are for jus in bello. So what we're going to start with today here in particular is the Independence Thesis. The idea that these 4 parts of just war theory are independent, that the moral justice or injustice of declaring the war is independent of the justice of how you fight it, is independent of the justice of how you end it and do peacekeeping, and it's independent of then issues about when you use force short of war. And in particular, we're going to focus on whether or not the first 2 are independent. Is the justice of the war itself independent of the justice of how you fight it? Or is it not? So the idea that the justice of the war itself affects the justice of how you fight it is called the mutual dependence or interdependence thesis. And increasingly, contemporary scholarship called revisionist just war theory defends the interdependence or mutual dependence thesis. Increasingly, ethicists and legal scholars are beginning to say that, well, the justice of the war itself maybe should affect the legitimate means of fighting it. That the less clearly just your war is, perhaps the greater the restrictions on how you ought to fight it. And maybe the more obviously just your cause, the war itself, maybe the fewer the restrictions on how you should fight it. So, for the folks defending the interdependence thesis, the idea that the justice of the war itself and the justice of how you fight it are related, they do depend on each other, then, well, what is exactly the nature of the interdependence? Is it the type of conflicts? So should we have the same rules for so-called symmetric wars between what are called peer militaries, right? The US versus China, versus an asymmetric war, say the US versus Islamic State? Should we have the same kind of rules for regional and world wars? Should we have the same rules for civil wars, for ethnic wars or religious wars, for anti-terrorism and peacekeeping? Should the rules all be the same? Should what's legitimate depend on, for example, the type of war being fought? Or perhaps, could it be the type of combatants that make a difference to the interdependence thesis? Should it matter if it's a large nation state or a small one? Or a non-state actor like Islamic State or Al-Qaeda? Or can businesses declare war? Supposedly, North Korea cyber-attacked Sony Pictures a few years ago. Was that an act of war or not? What about the combatants? Could interdependence depend on them? And at least one prominent scholar named B.J. Strouser says, yeah. He says there should be what he calls reasonable perceived liability, RPL, which will result in the need for specialized ROEs, rules of engagement. The idea simply is this. Suppose you're a baker who works in a town near a military base, and your one contract, your entire supply, your entire business is simply supplying bread to the military base. Well, are you a combatant or a non-combatant? In traditional just war theory, you're a non-combatant. You're a civilian who simply does work, right? You are in no way a legitimate target. And what Strouser says is, well, that doesn't seem to be quite right. Your entire job is to supply the military. And if you were in fact part of the military, a baker for the military, you're clearly a legitimate target. So why is the fact that you're a baker whose entire business is serving the military, but the bureaucratic listing is that you're a consultant, right? Or a supplier rather than an employee, somehow render you completely free from a legitimate attack? And so maybe you shouldn't be as free to be attacked as a frontline soldier, but maybe you shouldn't be thought of as having complete immunity to a legitimate attack either. We're going to tie this to a concept that's crucial in military ethics called military necessity later on. Now, another issue that can come up is called weapon type. And we need to define so-called dual-use weapons. These are weapons that can have a military purpose, but also have a legitimate civilian purpose. So, does that matter for the kinds of wars and the justice of how you fight them? If you're using dual-use weapons, should they be banned or not banned? Should that depend on the kind of war you're fighting or the justice of the war itself? What about lethal versus non-lethal weapons? For example, under international humanitarian law, blinding weapons are forbidden, but weapons that kill, like bullets, are not. Should that be the case? Should it depend on the type of war, whether that's the case? Chemical weapons are banned under international humanitarian law. But notice not by, for example, the police force. So they can use a chemical weapon on civilians, but, well, soldiers are not supposed to. Is that right? Should it depend on, well, the force of the weapon? A ballistic missile obviously carries a lot bigger punch than a bullet. And should it depend perhaps even on, well, the location of the weapon? So I don't know if any of you have heard of a rod from God before. I love the nickname for it here. A rod from God is basically a large shaped tungsten arrow with no explosive. And the idea of a rod from God is you launch it from space. And, well, for you folks who understand basic physics of kinetic energy, traveling 36,000 feet per second means at impact, even without any kind of explosive charge, you get a big result. So a typically sized so-called rod from God fired from space hitting a target on the Earth would result in an explosion that is comparable to the Hiroshima nuke, without, of course, the radiation. Should we have different rules for space-based war than for terrestrial war? Should it matter who's doing the fighting? Should we have the same rules for robots fighting wars as for when humans do so? And should it matter whether they're in, on, or out of the loop? If you're not familiar with these terms, let me, well, help you out. Right now, the US military, and as far as we know, other world militaries, supposedly use robots only with a human in the loop. And what that means is that before a robot, like say a Predator drone flying over Afghanistan, decides to launch its Hellfire missile at a target, a human first has to say, yes, that's the legitimate target. They have to look through their screen at Creech Air Force Base outside of Las Vegas and see what the robot's cameras are seeing and authorize that, yes, that is on our list of legitimate targets. And then after they've authorized that this is the legitimate target, they have to then press a button that then orders the robot to fire the missile. That's a human in the loop. Now, a human on the loop is when the robot itself, perhaps using facial recognition, already says, here's the legitimate target from our target list, human. and fire or no fire. The human's still on the loop when the human doesn't make the targeting decision, but still makes the firing decision. Humans will be out of the loop when humans don't make the targeting decision and don't make the firing decision. When the robot itself, when the AI says, I've got a facial recognition or however it's identifying it, it's got a legitimate target, it makes the firing decision itself, it fires the weapon, and the only thing a human can do is recall it after the fact. So, should the rules for how we fight wars be the same regardless of whether humans are in, on, or entirely out of the loop? A big deal in this conversation, and what the Committee to Stop Killer Robots has insisted on, is something called MHC, Meaningful Human Control. And their argument is that even putting humans on the loop, much less out of the loop, is to give up meaningful human control. If we're going to use military robots at all, a human must always be in the loop. We're going to talk about whether or not that's defensible momentarily. Then there are cyber attacks. I was part of an NSF grant studying the ethics of this a couple years ago. Stuxnet, almost a decade ago now, was an attack that, well, nobody officially owned up to it, but unofficially, the US and Israel basically did it together, that attacked centrifuges in Iran and caused them to spin wildly out of control and malfunction. And it set back the Iranian nuclear program by at least a couple of years. Was that an act of war? Was it justified? Does the kind of attack we use depend on the justice of the war itself? Would it be equally defensible if Iran did it to our centrifuges? All of these questions demand what in the military and ethics is called a red line analysis. We need to draw lines. In particular, we need to draw a line between war and not war. If we're going to say the rules of war apply, which is part of why use ad vim, the use of force short of war, has been such a big deal over the past 20 years. If we say cyber attacks are not war, is there anything to stop a permanent autonomous cyber defense? A permanent cyber war? Perhaps one that could destroy all cyber abilities across the whole world, just like mutually assured destruction with nukes. So I've raised lots of questions. Let's begin to look at some answers. Here's a common interdependence argument. In Robot Ethics 2.0 that I flashed up at you guys, we have an author named Leonard Kahn who explicitly makes this argument. If we allow the use of lethal autonomous weapon systems, that would cause unjust wars to be fought, because these autonomous killer robots would greatly decrease the cost of war, the so-called blood sacrifice. It would embolden political leaders to wage unjust, unnecessary wars, because now there's no political blowback because, well, you don't have soldiers coming home in body bags. So, if there's no downside to launching war, we're going to have a lot more of them. Simple supply and demand. And that will lead to many more unjust wars. And so Kahn says that means we should never allow laws to be used, even if they could satisfy use in bello restrictions like discrimination and proportionality, even if they could target combatants and avoid targeting non-combatants. Even if they could only use proportionate force, we still shouldn't use them because they're going to lead to all these unjust wars. So that's, notice, an interdependence argument. The ethics of jus in bello, of how we ought to conduct war, does depend on jus ad bellum, the justice of the war itself. We should engage in a jus in bello restriction, says Leonard Kant. We should ban killer robots, ban laws, because of jus ad bellum worries, because it will lead to unjust wars. Does this in fact prove interdependence? That the justice of how you conduct the war should depend on the war itself? And a related issue, could a robot ever have moral responsibility itself? If a robot commits a war crime, who's responsible? If it can't be responsible, who can be? Now, to answer these kinds of questions, we need to look at some meta-ethics, as it's called, the kind of ethical theory about ethics itself. And in particular, there's a principle called the principle of moral luck. And that's when one's morality or immorality depends on luck. To understand a principle of moral luck, you might think of an example like this. Suppose you're driving home after going to a bar, say the first night the bar is reopened. And you're so excited you have 19 shots. And then you crawl out of the bar, drunk as a skunk, and you get your keys and you start to drive home. And as you get to the final stop sign before you get home, you blow right through it. And you never saw it, but there was a kid who was about to enter the crosswalk, but the kid saw you blow right through the stop sign and stopped. So you didn't hit the kid. You drive on into your driveway. You stop the car, you unlock the door, you go home and go to sleep. According to the law, nothing happens to you. But on the other hand, suppose in our scenario, everything is the same except, well, the kid didn't see you blowing through the stop sign. And so the kid entered the intersection and you smashed the kid and killed him. And the police come and you were drunk. And now you're looking at vehicular homicide and probably 20 years or more in prison. And what's the difference between the two? Anything under your control? No. The difference is entirely on something that's entirely out of your control, whether the kid sees you and reacts in time. If we think those two cases should be thought of as morally different, the irresponsible in the second case where the kid doesn't see you, and you're not responsible in the first where the kid does, if you think there's a moral difference between those two cases, then you believe in what's called moral luck. And moral luck violates a principle of ethics called the ought implies can principle. You should only be morally responsible for what's within your control, for what you can do and can avoid doing. Unless you had a rational choice over whether or not this happened, it shouldn't be a matter of your responsibility. So if someone knocks you unconscious and grabs you by the feet and swings you around and uses you to harm others, that'd be pretty funny to see. But when the police come to break it up, no one's going to arrest you, the unconscious person. They're going to arrest the person who knocked you unconscious and swung you around, because you didn't have a choice. So the ought implies can principle seems to underlie our basic ethical thinking that moral responsibility demands agency, the capacity for the rational exercise of free will. And so it seems like a proper moral theory would not have any place for moral luck. If that's right, well, that seems like support for the independence thesis then. Because remember, the independence thesis is the justice of how you fight a war is completely independent of the justice of the war itself. And do soldiers have any control over whether or not a war is being fought? No, they're not the president. They're not the person making the decision about whether or not this nation state fights a war. Their only decisions are about how they fight or don't fight the war, their conduct within. Did you have any control over the fact you were born in the country you were born in? And so almost certainly serve in their military if you serve in their military at all? No, it's a matter of luck that say I was born in the United States instead of China. And so if I served in a military, I would be serving in the US military and not the Chinese military. And it's just as much a matter of luck that someone was born in China. And so if they serve in the military, would be born and serve in the Chinese military, not the US military. This seems to support the independence thesis then. But not so fast. Because after all, if I'd been born in, well, 1920 in Germany on this analysis, I would have had no choice but to serve in the German military, to be a Nazi soldier. And so can we say then a Nazi soldier had no control over, well, Germany continuing to fight in World War II? The only issue is whether or not how they should conduct themselves in the war. Well, that's actually not entirely true. This brings up what we would call a collective responsibility problem. You see, if you don't like your nation's choice about going to war, well, first of all, in democracies, you can vote. Now, of course, that's indirect. But more to the point, you can immigrate. If your society is fighting a war that you don't endorse, you could, well, leave your society. Now, of course, that brings up other issues. But to say you have literally no choice at all isn't true. You don't have to remain a member of that society. Well, suppose you're already a member of the military. And your society has just started to fight a war that's unjust. Well, even then, you still have a choice. You could always surrender. You could always refuse to fight. Now, again, there are consequences. But to say you literally have no choice is, well, false. And let's be clear. If one Nazi soldier had surrendered, would that have stopped World War II? No. And if two Nazi soldiers had surrendered, would that have stopped World War II? No. But if enough of them had, well, that certainly would have stopped, or in fact, never started World War II. So this is called a collective responsibility problem. It is true that by yourself, you may not be able to completely affect change, but you and your choices do play a role. So let's look at some scenarios and think about how these issues about robots and just war could play out in, well, possible futures. Scenario number one, whenever it actually makes the press, it's interesting. The military's got some leaks, but just a month ago or so, SpaceX said they and the military are going to work together on a cargo shipping plan. where SpaceX is going to engage in, well, rockets that launch high-value cargo from one place to another rather rapidly. But the military already has a plan called Project Sustain for using such space cargo shipping, or the original plan involved something like Virgin Galactic and a space tourism, right? Low Earth joyrides. As well, a dual use technology. Yeah, we can use it for space tourism or space cargo shipping, but the same craft that can take tourists on a space joyride could take, well, SEAL Team 6 for an extremely rapid deployment so that you could be anywhere in the world within 2 hours after deployment. This could radically change the nature of warfare. Should the justice of whether or not we do that depend on the justice of the war itself or not? Russia and the NATO alliance have had a frozen conflict for, well, over 60 years now. But anti-satellite weapons mean it could become hot at any time now, without any direct terrestrial conflict. Or China has satellites, and so does Taiwan. What would happen if a commercial dispute became a military dispute in space, say? Again, would the justice of how you respond to that depend on the justice of the war itself? A hot topic in space is space mining, the moon, or more likely asteroids. And there have been insane claims about the mineral wealth to be made by mining asteroids, if only we could get there and get it back to Earth. And there are some companies, some startups like Planetary Resources that supposedly plan on doing this. We'll see how realistic their plans are. So suppose Planetary Resources set up a space mining operation to harvest valuable minerals from an asteroid. And the Saudis say, we'd really like this war in Yemen with the Houthi rebels to get over with. So why don't you fashion one of those rod from gods from just the dross, the leftover chunks from your mining? We didn't even have to be the valuable minerals, right? And launch something that has the power of a nuke at the Houthi bases from space. Planetary Resources then could be basically a contractor for the Saudi military. That's a dual use issue, but also an issue for, well, what should the rules be? Should they depend on the justice of the war itself? Anti-satellite weapons from private contractors. Should SpaceX be allowed to engage in war? And finally, Elon Musk, speaking of SpaceX, has plans to start to try to colonize Mars. Supposedly in the next 10 years, although, shall we say, his timeline might be a bit aggressive. Suppose we had competing colonization missions, say even wanting the same site. If they started a conflict, is that a war? What if it's an unmanned robot attacking a colonization mission? A lethal autonomous weapon system. Here's another scenario. Unfortunately, perhaps not that far-fetched. Suppose the Russians, speaking of NATO, invade Lithuania to form a contiguous land border with their exclave in Kaliningrad. And they're going to do it using biological warfare, which, since it's indiscriminate, is banned under international humanitarian law. They've developed a biological agent that will kill the non-Russian inhabitants. The Russians already have the vaccine. And the NATO scientists know about this, and well, they're developing a vaccine to defend Lithuania and the rest of the world. And suppose you're a Russian warfighter and your commanding officer tells you to shoot a NATO soldier that's guarding the entrance to the lab where these NATO scientists are working on a vaccine, so that your fellow soldiers can assassinate the remaining scientists. Now, your fellow soldiers then are planning on committing a war crime. Scientists are non-combatants under international humanitarian law. But the soldiers guarding the lab are legitimate combatants. So what the commanding officer is asking you to do is, under international humanitarian law, not a war crime. It's perfectly legitimate. Or is it? Should it depend on the justice of your cause, the justice of the war itself? What if it wasn't you, a human, being told by your commanding officer to shoot the NATO soldiers guarding the entrance? What if instead the order was given to a lethal autonomous weapons system? We'll bring this to then, since we've invoked the specter of a pandemic already, to what we'll call the ultimate scenario, one that involves existential risk. And an existential risk we'll define as a risk that human level intelligence ceases to exist. So many catastrophic risks, like near-term global warming, are not true existential risks. Global warming may be really, really bad over the next century, but it's extremely, extremely unlikely that it's going to kill all 7.5 billion humans. So an existential risk is a risk that, if realized, means game over humanity. So, suppose the lethal autonomous weapons systems attacking us are not made by humans, but by aliens, as in innumerable science fiction movies. Should there be any restrictions on how we fight? An alien robot army, or biological aliens for that matter? In a scenario called by the military supreme emergency, and already in traditional just war theory, then in a supreme emergency, use and bellow restrictions go away. If the cause of the war is a true supreme emergency, like an existential risk, there's a part of just war theory, a part of international law that already says, hey, no restrictions, fight them any way you have to, it's a supreme emergency. So suppose there's an Armageddon religious cult with a biological weapon that could wipe out humanity. Should there be any restrictions on how we stop them? Well, from the standpoint of two different ethical theories, the answer should be clearly no. A utilitarian that says we should just act for the greatest good means preventing human extinction will always maximize expected utility. The probability of the benefit times the magnitude of the benefit, right? The magnitude of the benefit is a potential infinite number of, or near infinite number of future humans. And that's worth any harm that it takes to realize. Preventing the future extinction of humanity is worth any finite cost, essentially, is the claim. Well, suppose you're not a utilitarian, but a deontologist, someone who thinks about ethics in terms of rights and duties. Well, from a deontological approach, an ethics of duty, we can articulate the extinction principle. One always has a moral obligation never to allow the extinction of all creatures capable of moral obligation. It's an absolute duty. It wins any conflict it has with any other duty. And when you think about it, it seems, well, at least intuitively clear that that must be the case. Because after all, if you allow the extinction of all creatures capable of moral obligation because of some other duty that it conflicted with, well, of course, you can't fulfill the other duty because everyone is dead. So it seems as if your highest, most absolute duty is to keep things capable of duties around. If you fail to fulfill that duty, there are no other duties. So let's reach some at least preliminary conclusions then. Meta-ethical principle of moral luck. If your ethical theory incorporates moral luck, well, it's wrong. Now, what does that mean for just war theory? It means that the Independence Thesis, nonetheless, is false, though under many circumstances it may be approximately true. The question is how much control you have, and hence how much does any particular factor in your moral reasoning depend on the others? And that may change depending on your legitimate or illegitimate role in the conflict and the justice of the conflict itself. I think Strauser was on the right track with this RPL. So moral luck is a necessary but not sufficient condition to guide such assessments. Lethal autonomous weapon systems complicate this, but also reinforce it. They are not, for the foreseeable future, responsible for any war crimes they themselves commit. So we're going to have to think about how humans will be responsible, and I'll have a suggestion momentarily. But if you defend interdependence, then we need to re-understand this concept of military necessity that justifies lessening restrictions on how you conduct a war. Then this doctrine should be widened to assess the degree of moral necessity of the just side winning for a lasting peace and a flourishing post-war society. It shouldn't only be for supreme emergencies. Let's give you an example to help you think about it. President Truman essentially thought we needed to do whatever it took to guarantee the Nazis did not rule the world. And that's why the Manhattan Project happened. It was absolutely crucial that the right side won that war, that totalitarian regimes did not take over the world. And so we'll be willing to do whatever it takes, even nuclear war, to prevent that from happening. But in wars with less moral necessity of the just side winning, like, for example, say the conflict between the US and opposing forces in Iraq or Afghanistan, or the Saudi conflict with the Houthi rebels in Yemen. Well, I mentioned there's a way of understanding, at least that I defend, how we should think about using lethal autonomous weapon systems in such wars. And I term this the discrimination command principle. If you want to use a lethal autonomous weapons system in a just military conflict, I'm not going to say it, unlike the Committee to Stop Killer Robots, that it should be absolutely forbidden. No, I think it should be allowed, but under this condition. Who's going to bear the responsibility if a robot commits a war crime? I think that should be the commanding officer who chooses to use it in battle, who says, I'm making the choice to use this weapon in battle. If it commits a crime, that's on me. So identify that military official, the commanding officer. Unless someone of equivalent or higher rank in the military was willing to play the role of a non-combatant, in a realistic simulation before deployment, then the actual deployment of that killer robot would be immoral. If the US military wants to use lethal autonomous weapon systems in Iraq, they better have a general at Fort Benning be willing to play the role of an Iraqi civilian in a realistic simulated deployment of their new weapon system. If they're willing to do that and take whatever happens, okay. So, with proper safeguards, I think a just state could use lethal autonomous weapon systems to enforce a lasting peace and a flourishing just war society. But an unjust state, of course, could use laws to enforce its tyranny, potentially without the possibility of revolt. Technology is going to change the calculus of political power and political opposition. If a tyrannical state armed with lethal autonomous weapon systems chooses to use all the forces at its disposal to enforce its tyranny, rebellion may well be impossible. Citizens armed with guns will not be able to defeat a poisonous drone swarm with facial recognition that's told to go kill them. Killer robots offer great possibilities for just states and terrifying possibilities for unjust states. So my final conclusion: to stop indefinite tyranny with new tech by an unjust state, I think just states should have no in bello restrictions on lethal autonomous weapon systems or any other technology to avoid the possibility of indefinite tyranny, of something approximating existential risk. In the near future, just states, I think, must be willing to do whatever it takes to ensure new tech does not allow a permanent tyranny to take root. I know that's a sobering ending, but I'll be happy in the few minutes before we break here to take any questions anyone has.
Thank you, Keith, for this really excellent talk. I believe it really gives us insight into something that many of us in AI don't focus on, which is this sort of the softer science, if you will, of what exactly is just and not. With that, yes, is there anyone who would like to, is there anyone here who has questions?
Maybe I can start, but I'll have more time to discuss this later on. So you were talking, of course, about, there's huge consequences like, loss of life, but how much can you extend the same thinking to other decisions and actions AI might be talking, such even some sort of, harms related to software decisions like, who to grant, credit to, or other cases, situations where AI is used all the time. Where does the type of reasoning stops?
I'm sorry, do you mean like, for example, the Chinese social credit system using AI?
Or any kind of AI decisions that being done, for example, risk scores assigned to defendants by laws, like can we still use the same type of reasoning? Mm-hmm.
Right. Those are definitely worrying, and I've done some work on those. And matter of fact, I'll tell you what, I'll go ahead and share one thing that was literally published today on one aspect of this. Campus surveillance technologies and COVID. Big brother goes to school. And so I can send you that link if you want. There are serious issues there. those weren't the focus of my talk, because I wanted to kind of dramatically underline the point that our old assumptions, again, it's ought implies can.
Mhm.
What we've assumed in the past as responsible limitations on privacy or guarantees of privacy, responsible limitations on harm, have been against the background of, well, certain things are impossible, like, for example, enforcing a perfect tyranny, right, through mass surveillance. And my point is simple here, is that that's going to change. If it hasn't already, it's looming.
Mhm.
That technology is going to enable unjust states to do terrible things that before, if they had been attempted, people could have rebelled against.
I see.
But
Now, yeah.
in the
Now they
not very
haven't
distant
rebelled.
future, they're not going to be able to rebel against. And so, unfortunately, I think that's going to have implications for the limits of permissible surveillance. But when the stakes are lower, the restrictions should be greater. So, for example, I think the restrictions and the level of permissible surveillance, right, and AI decision making on, say, tracking students through campus, which is what that article today is in part about, should be quite different than tracking the people who, for example, enrich nuclear weapons, right?
Mhm.
Or work on biological, weaponizable, gain of function biological viruses. It may be in the not very distant future that those folks are going to have to accept a much more invasive level of surveillance, and, well, perhaps even worse, if we're going to avoid a truly, truly, truly worst case outcome.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, I look forward to talking more about this.
Yeah. Any other questions?
I guess I'll ask one final question before we leave, which is the question of dual use. I mean, it's very interesting to mention the Elon Musk example, because I feel like a dual use is an enormous history. Whether we talk about, say, as very recent examples, the Eisenhower interstate system was meant both for making travel easier, but the restrictions, for example, on the bridges are absolutely because it had a military implication, or the internet. While some parts of it were certainly created for the benefit of 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 humanity. I mean, the World Wide Web was invented by CERN, but the internet itself was created by DARPA, was created by the Department of Defense. So obviously there would have to be some sort of military application there. So I guess with that, the question is there uh, given the dual use, I mean, how does one determine the so you're saying, like, for lower priority things, you might have a greater need for ethics. You might have you might want to not track each individual down to the meter for who are students, for example. But given there's some of this technology with dual use, where on one hand it can be completely benign, on the other hand it's absolutely not. Where do you separate the line between increasing your ethics and decreasing your ethics if it's ambiguous?
Yeah, I guess I would slightly rephrase that as, I think it's ethics all the way up and down. But in a sense, what we're talking about are kind of the restrictions on human freedom, the trade-off of freedom and security. And I think the lower the stakes, the more freedom we should have. And the higher the stakes, well, perhaps the less. And as technology goes, that's going to enable new threats that had never before been imagined, that also depend, for example, on location. So we don't think of a monolith of the sort that's been popping up all over the world, right, as a dual use weapon here on the surface of the Earth. But if you had that same monolith in space and dropped it, right, in a highly targeted way at a place on the surface of the Earth, moving at, well, 17,000 miles an hour, it would make a really big boom when it hit. And suddenly it does have a military aspect that it simply doesn't have in a different context, in a different location. So I don't think monoliths should be tightly regulated here on Earth. But if I wanted to fashion one in space, all of a sudden that's got entirely different implications. And now, we might have to think a lot more carefully about, well, what's permissible to do, how closely we should surveil it, what kind of privacy expectations we should have, and so forth and so on. Because when the context radically changes, when what we can do radically changes, there arise brand new questions about what we ought or ought not to do.
I see. Thank you. And of course, I think I'll be talking to you more about this afternoon.
Great.
With that, though, since it's after 12, I think we can end the talk. And Amy, I believe you can stop recording.